شيء لله يا الله بذرة من محبة الله يا الله تحيي فؤادي شيء لله أفنى بها عن كل ما سوى الله يا الله بين العباد شيء لله الرب صلى إيمان وسلم يا الله على المكرم ما زمزم الحادي وما ترنم يا الله في الليل أظلم شيء لله فما أراجي اليوم كشف كربا يا الله مما أعاني شيء لله إلا انصفى لي مشرب المحبة يا الله في كأس هاني شيء لله الرب صلى إيمان وسلم يا الله على المكرم ما زمزم الحادي وما ترنم يا الله في الليل أظلم شيء لله واعلم بأن الخير كله أجمع يا الله إن كنت تسمع لله ضمن اتباعك للنبي المشفع يا الله الباب فاقرع شيء لله الرب صلى إيمان وسلم يا الله على المكرم لا ما زمزم الحادي وما ترنم يا الله في الليل أظلم شيء لله صلى عليه له ما تشعشع يا الله من كل مطلع لا فجر وما سالت عيون الأشعاب يا الله منها تفرع شيء لله الرب صلى إيمان وسلم يا الله على المكرم لله ما زمزم الحادي وما ترنم يا في الليل أظلم شيء لله اللهم صل وسلم وبارك عليه وعلى صلى الله على محمد صلى الله على محمد صلى الله على محمد وعلى آله وسلم صلى الله على محمد صلى الله على محمد صلى الله على محمد وعلى آله وسلم قد بدا وجه الحبيب قد بدا وجه الحبيب قد بدا وجه الحبيب لاح في وقت السحار نوره قد عم قلبي نوره قد عم قلبي نوره قد عم قلبي فسجدت بانكسار صلى الله على محمد صلى الله على محمد صلى الله محمد وعلى آله وسلم. قال لي ارفع واسألني، قال لي ارفع واسألني، قال لي ارفع واسألني، فلكم كل وطار. قلت أنت حسبي، قلت أنت حسبي، قلت أنت حسبي، ليس لي عنك اصطبار. صلى الله على محمد، صلى الله على محمد، صلى الله على محمد وعلى آله وسلم. قال عبدي لك بشرى، قال عبدي لك بشرى، قال عبدي لك بشرى، فتنعم بالنظر. أنت كنز لعبادي، أنت كنز لعبادي، أنت كنز لعبادي، أنت ذكرى للبشر. صلى الله لا محمد، صلى الله على محمد، صلى الله على محمد آله وسلم. كل حسن وجمال، كل حسن وجمال، كل حسن وجمال في الورى من انتشار. بطنت أوصاف ذاتي، بطنت أوصاف ذاتي، بطنت أوصاف ذاتي، وتجلت في الآثار. صلى الله على محمد، صلى الله على محمد، صلى الله على محمد وعلى آله وسلم. إنما الكون معان، إنما الكون معان، إنما الكون معان قائمات بالصور. كل من يدرك هذا، كل من يدرك هذا، كل من يدرك هذا كان من أهل العبار. صلى الله على محمد، صلى الله على محمد، صلى الله على محمد وعلى آله وسلم. لم يذق لذة عيش، لم يذق لذة عيش، لم يذق لذة عيش الذي عنا انحصر. ربنا صل على من، ربنا صل على من، ربنا صل على من نوره عم البشر. صلى الله محمد، صلى الله على محمد، صلى الله على محمد وعلى آله وسلم. اللهم صل وسلم وبارك عليه وعلى آله.
بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين وأفضل الصلاة وتم التسليم على سيدنا ومولانا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم أجمعين. سبحانك لا علم لنا إلا ما علمتنا إنك أنت العليم الحكيم ولا حول ولا قوة إلا بالله العلي العظيم. As we progress through the material of this blessed book, we have now reached the 5th session. And so just a brief recap in terms of how we got to where we are and where we will be going. That yesterday evening, last night, we had an introductory class that introduced the concept of the halal and the haram. And then we followed up with that to focus on the virtue of the halal and haram, of the virtue of the halal and the reprehensibility of the haram. And this morning, we wanted to establish the foundations of understanding what the halal and the haram is, and how we begin with this in our religious practice, i.e. doing what is halal, avoiding what is haram. And we set the tone for the present session in the previous session, talking about the stations of religion and the various degrees of taqwa. And I hope that made sense. If it's the first time we're hearing it, it might be a little bit difficult to understand. But what we hope is as we progress in the understanding of our religion, we'll develop what you could call religious maturity. And what religious and spiritual maturity is, you feel very comfortable because you know where you're at and you know where you need to go. And in doing so, is that it will allow you to also interact with other people in a proper way. Because if you know where you're at and you know where you need to go, then you're not going to let someone else confuse you. Oftentimes our confusion comes from other people and what it is that they say, what it is that they think, and where they think we should be, or what do they think that we should be doing. And you're doing something and all of a sudden you sit with someone and they question it, or they ask you, what is your dalil for it, brother? What is your proof for it, or whatever it might be. And that knowing what it is that we're doing is not a bad thing, right? However, is that we need to be firm in our deen and to know that what it is that we're doing is correct. And once you do that, one of the great signs, and this is the beautiful thing, I've always seen this from my teachers, they're so certain about the truth that they are on, they don't feel a need to criticize other people to make themselves stronger. Sometimes people's own insecurity manifests in their criticism of others. Now that's in relationships, and that's the whole psychology of it, but it's a separate thing. But also in terms of someone's faith, in terms of someone's conviction, is that if you're certain about what it is that you're on, and what it is that you're doing in terms of your deen, you're not going to feel the need to criticize other people, to condemn other people. That if there's an opportunity to clarify truth, you take it. But there's not a need to condemn or criticize or to go overboard in these matters. And this is why one of the great signs of misguidance is to tend to incline towards argumentation and dispute. And that is not a good sign. And in fact, that our Prophet warned against this, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, is that no people will be given that will go astray after having been given guidance. Illa utul jadal, except that they will take to argumentation or dispute. May Allah protect us and preserve us. So, session 5. This is titled Scrupulousness. The Arabic word is wara, and its degrees. So we want to begin by talking a little bit about what wara is and moving towards a working definition of it, bi'idhnillahi ta'ala. And so there is a beautiful quote that Imam Ghazali, he speaks about wara in multiple places of the Ihya. In fact, he speaks about it in book 1 in Kitab al-Ilm. And the same breakdown that he mentions here, which is book 14, he mentions in book 1. And that he says in relation to the importance of the wara is that this is that the milak of the deen, is that this is the foundation of the religion and the foundation of that ascending degrees of closeness to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And so at its very heart, this blessed religious trait itself is, you could say, the trait whereby which is that we actively in the moment are preferring the hereafter over what we might want in this world. So this is why it's such an important trait. It's an amazing trait. Is that every time that we show scrupulousness, what are we doing? Essentially, what are we doing? We're preferring the hereafter over the things of this world in that very moment. And so the more that that trait becomes embedded in us in its balanced and correct way, the more that we will actively be living in every moment of our life for the hereafter. And this is why it is such a foundational and important trait. And so what we didn't take, we were supposed to take in the previous session, was some spiritual paths have summarized their path, to summarize the path to Allah in the following way, by speaking of it in terms of traits, or you could say states of heart. And they speak of knowledge, action, sincerity, scrupulousness, and fear. And even though there's a long list of other traits, is that this, in a sense, summarizes, from one perspective, the spiritual path. So, of course, you have to begin with knowledge, ilm. Without knowledge, there's no reality to anything that anyone does. One has to have knowledge, and everything that one does has to be based upon and rooted in knowledge. But you can't, it's not enough just to have knowledge itself. You also have to put that knowledge into practice. Otherwise, what is the use of knowledge if you know something but you don't act upon it? But it's not enough to know, nor is it enough to just put that knowledge into practice. You have to do so sincerely. So think about all the things that we might do, but we lack knowledge. There's deficiencies in all those things. Or all the knowledge that we know, but we fail to put into practice. That opens up a whole other door of deficiency. And then the things that we know that we put into practice, where's our sincerity? Which is a prerequisite, of course, for the acceptance of that action. But then there's two states of heart that are really traits after that. And the fourth is the topic of this session, wara. In other words, it's not just enough to have knowledge, put that into practice in a sincere fashion. Is that we have to, over time, become more and more scrupulous. We become more and more careful in our religion. And this is what we hope, is as we get older and we become more and more religiously mature, is that there's things that we leave. There's things that we shed on the path to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And then this last trait is the trait of fear. In other words, is that even if someone has those four traits, there's no guarantees. You never know what your state is going to be with Allah. Even if you have knowledge that you put into practice sincerely and you're very careful and scrupulous in your religion, then you still have to be in a state of fear. Because we do not know what's going to happen to us in the hereafter. But fear is also, it's a very important trait. And we balance it, of course, with hope. That's normally we speak about fear being that the sister trait of hope. But here it's with the understanding that the more fear that we have of the hereafter and how we're going to fare in it, the more safety Allah is going to grant us, because He's too generous to join between us two fears. The more worried we are, the more fear that we have, the more that Allah Ta'ala will grant us safety in the hereafter. And that's not a trait that people tend to like to speak about, but it is a very important trait. It's part of our nature as human beings. But we're not to have fear, is that we would harm ourselves much more than we do. It's a very important trait. And that ultimately is that the more that we come to know Allah, specifically in relation to His majestic attributes, the more fear that we will have, necessarily. Because when you think about the majestic attributes of Allah, He's our Rabb, He's our Lord. He has to have majestic attributes, as well as that beautiful attributes subhanahu wa ta'ala. So let's look at a few ahadith and athar. Athar, reports of the Salaf. So there's a hadith that says, خَيْرُ دِينِكُمْ الْوَرَعُ. The greatest manifestation of your religion is in wara', this trait of scrupulousness. And then the Prophet said to Abu Huraira, Ya Abu Huraira, kun wari'an, be scrupulous, tukun a'bad nas, and you will be the most worshipful of people. Look at that. So this trait itself is associated here in this hadith with worship. And you can think about it in the way that we mentioned, is that in those moments of actively preferring the hereafter over this world, it's as if you're in a state of worship. And so that a'bad nas, our Prophet said, you'll be the most worshipful of people if you're a person of wara'. And then another hadith, the Prophet said, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, al-wara'u sayyidul amal. Scrupulousness is the preeminent act of worship. It's the preeminent act of worship that we can do. And we have a number of different stories of acts of scrupulousness. One is the one we've already heard about Sayyidina Abu Bakr Siddiq, who, when he was given that drink of milk, and he drank some, and then asked his servant about it, and then was told that it was something that he did from the time of Jahiliyyah, and that was unlawful, and they were repaying him then. So then he went and forced it out of his system. And sometimes that you have to do this. And that if you ever eat something and then look at the ingredients and la hawla wa la quwwata illa billah, there's an ingredient that is haram. That's what you have to do. You go to the bathroom, and I'm not going to describe how to do it. Everyone knows how to do it. And you do your best to make it come out. Because he's careful. And he knows the words of the Prophet. Kullu suhtan nabata min kullu lahman nabata min suht fannaru awla bih. It's a hadith. Is that any flesh, so anything that grows in your body from suht, which is another word for haram, that grows from the fire has more right to it. And so in other words, that if you consume unlawful food, it's not a good state to be in. So he was very scrupulous. He went and forced himself to throw up, and so that he could get that out of his system. And there's a story of Sayyidina Umar al-Khattab, is that when he accidentally drank from camel's milk that is not his, he did something similar. And Sayyidah Aisha, because she learned from the Prophet ﷺ, is that she said something similar to what our Prophet said. And she said that, إِنَّكُمْ لَتَغْفَلُونَ عَنْ أَفْضَلَ الْعِبَادِ. Indeed, that you're heedless of the greatest form of worship, هُوَ الْوَرَعُ, which is scrupulousness. And Abdullah ibn Umar, the great son of Umar ibn Khattab, who was from the most scrupulous of people. And many of the positions of Imam Malik, this is one of the golden chains of that narration, is that Malik, that and Nafi' and Ibn Umar. Is that when you hear that chain, La ilaha illallah, right? Listen very carefully. This is one of the golden chains of narration. The great Imam Malik, who he himself was from the most scrupulous of people, and the adab that he had with Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam was amazing. Is that he would refuse to relieve himself in the city of Medina. And of course, during those times, is that the actual city of Medina was much smaller. It was roughly the tiled area right now, in the area around the masjid of the Prophet ﷺ. He would go outside of the city to relieve himself. He would never ride a donkey inside the city of Medina. Nor would he, radiallahu anhu, is that wear shoes in the blessed city of the Prophet ﷺ. And so that he was a person of deep adab, and that knew how to practice his religion. And so Abdullah ibn Umar was known to be one of the companions who followed the Prophet the closest. And he says, is that were you to pray until that you be very skinny, and he says, were you to pray until that your back becomes bowed, and were you to fast until you become skinny as a string, he says, "Lam yuqbal dhalik minkum illa bi wara'in hajiz." This won't be accepted from you until that you have this trait of scrupulousness. That prevents you from falling into what comes after it. And then that there's also that ulama that have spoken specifically about that food and that about one's wealth and the importance of that protecting ourselves from unlawful sources. Some of them have said is that a servant will eat that a morsel of food or some type of food, and their heart will change, and they might not ever return to their previous state. And so that if we're going to be scrupulous, we should be scrupulous in food without going to excess, of course. But what we want to do is to make sure that, and really, it's actually very simple, but it's so hard. It's simple because of the type of foods we like to eat. It's hard because of the type of foods that we like to eat. But if we eat simply, it's a lot easier. If we were content with just basic food and some form of grain that you cook and some basic spices and very simple foods, it's fairly easy. But the problem is all of the highly processed foods that we eat. If we would eat less processed foods and eat more wholesome, good foods, it would be so much easier for us to maintain. If we stopped eating out so much and ate at home mostly and actually cooked our food and got rid of canned food, it's a lot easier just to cook a can of food, right? But if you actually buy that dried fava beans and you have to soak them overnight and peel the outer shell, the outer casing around them, and then cook them, that takes a lot more time, right? If you want to cook real oats take about 25 minutes to cook. They're not like the instant 2-minute oats, but they're a lot better for you. They're not more wholesome the way they make you feel. So it's not hard to get nice, pure, organic oats, but you need someone who's willing to be in the kitchen for 25 minutes, but everybody's busy. Men are busy, women are busy, everyone's on the run all the time. And then we just pop something in the microwave, boom, and eat, or throw something together, or order some food from somewhere. And this is where we get ourselves in trouble all the time. And there's still permissible ways of doing that. But what I'm really saying is the importance of lifestyle. And in this regard is that traditional habits tend to be superior in this regard, traditional habits. And good food sometimes takes a lot longer. Wholesome food takes a lot longer to cook. But these are decisions that we make. And convincing the upcoming generation of future spouses of the importance of this is we already had the marriage retreat in March. But we maybe need to circle back. And that young men should learn to cook too, just as young women should learn to cook, to be able to provide themselves good meals. Because oftentimes young men are the ones who suffer the most, as that, especially when they're not married yet and they're on their own, and God knows what they eat, right? And sometimes that young women also have the same problem. And then we have this beautiful statement of Ibn al-Mubarak. And I say all that, if my wife here, she would tell you what a horrible cook I am. But there's easy things that you can do, right? Almond butter, organic almond butter. Allahu Akbar. Right? That's one of the great meals. I'll put it on like an organic rice cake with a little bit of almond butter and some nice honey. There you go. It's like a full meal. And that's actually very easy to make. It doesn't take a lot of time. A few carrots, dip it in some organic hummus, and there you go. You have healthy opportunities. So there's a statement of Ibn Mubarak rahimahullah ta'ala where he says, Raddu dirhamin min shubha, is that not accepting one dirham, which is a silver coin, a small amount of money, is more beloved to Allah than for you to give in charity bi mi'at alf dirham, than to give in charity 1 100,000 dirhams. ومئة ألف ومئة ألف حتى عد 600,000. He just kept going higher and higher until he reached 600,000. So for you to be very cautious about one dirham that you bring in is more beloved to Allah than for you to give out 600,000 dirhams in charity. Wow, that's a very different frame. That's a very different frame. Because the ulama have always said is that the greatest form of worship is tark al-ma'asi, avoiding acts of disobedience. This is why this is so important. We have to get the frame of the halal and the haram correct. Because unfortunately, these terms are oftentimes used to like beat people down, right? The halal and haram. Sometimes people even hear them and like, and they associate it with this certain way of being, and with certain people beating them over the head with it, as opposed to gently encouraging them to become more and more scrupulous. There's a big difference between the two, and we don't want to be those type of people that push people away from the religion. And we need to be very careful about that. But this is true, is that being very cautious about what we bring in is a greater priority than everything that is that we give out. So what really is wara? If we look at some definitions that we translate it as scrupulousness. Scrupulousness is someone's very concerned to avoid doing wrong. You could also translate it as carefulness, which is to make sure of avoiding potential danger, mishap, or harm. These are just linguistic definitions of the word scrupulousness and carefulness. Ultimately, just like taqwa, you can't really translate it. Just think of it as wara, and khalas, you don't even need a translation. But also, it's a type of cautiousness. And really, when we talk about wara from that more Sharia definition, it relates to the various degrees of halal and haram. Is that it really is about being very careful about what it is that we do in every aspect of our life, everything that we consume, everything that we do, and making sure is that it is as close as could be to something that is not only permissible but pleasing to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And so here in this section is when he also too mentions about the various types of halal and haram, and the same word that Sayyid Yusuf spoke about this one. He says, al-haram kullu khabith, that all of it is filthy, vile, and disgusting, and some of it is worse than other types. And likewise, the halal, there are certain things that are more pure than others. And this is something that we want to really think about when we give our money out, is that ideally that we give the very best of our income and the very best of things. We don't want to get in this habit of giving old furniture to the masjid. You don't want anything anymore, just okay, give it to the masjid, right? That type of attitude is not correct. Is that we should give the most pure form of wealth to religious causes, the masjid, educational institutions, and so forth. And certainly that when there's types of wealth that are obligatory for us to give out, like zakat, which is there to purify our wealth, and there's certain people that are there that can receive that. And there's other types of wealth, let's say for instance that someone acquired some form of haram wealth, or that someone was given some form of haram wealth. There's a way to dispose of it. And in general, this type of wealth should be given for what are called the masalih al-muslimin, the types of things that are of general benefit to the believers. And that amongst this category as well is that people that are really in need. And so that's a whole process. We'll speak a little bit about that tomorrow, about what do we do if you had a haram investment and the principle was halal, but then the money that came from it was haram. What do you do in that instance, and how do you get rid of it, and what do you do with it? We'll discuss that in a little bit more detail. So looking at the degrees of the halal and the haram, Imam Ghazali mentions in this book 4 ascending degrees of wara, and he gives each one a title. So the lowest is called the wara al-udul, the scrupulousness of the upright. And then the second highest degree is called the wara of the salihin, the scrupulousness of the righteous. The third degree is called the scrupulousness of the God conscious, the wara' of the muttaqeen. And then the highest degree of all is called the wara' as-siddiqeen, the scrupulousness of the highest saints. So what are the essential definitions of each one of these? So first of all, we have the wara' of the udul. And the udul relates to a concept that we have in fiqh, that there's a certain criterion whereby which someone becomes upright. And when we talk about their adalah, their uprightness, is that this had repercussions insofar as it meant whether or not that they could be a legitimate witness for something. And that there's a difference between, in the Shafi school at least, the adl of riwayah and the adl of shahada. We're not going to get into that. But there's traits that need to be there. And in general, is that these people have to be upright. And what is meant by that is that they're not people that persist in smaller, lesser sins or that commit major sins. And in some degrees of accepting someone's shahada, you would add to that anything that would take away what's called their muru'ah, their legal respectability. So this was very important in Muslim culture, meaning that if there were certain things that were considered to be from muru'ah, legal respectability to do, and someone did them, is that because they did those things, is that they would lose their ability to have standing in society, which we don't seek it for the sake of having standing, but we ultimately have to have a balance in relation to our reputation, that preserving our reputation insofar as it is needed for the affairs, our affairs, is something that is important. But as long as we don't do everything for reputation, and as long as, again, is that we don't beat our children, especially over the head, with the idea of shame and what people are going to say and so forth and so on, that could be very destructive. And at some point is that you have to be very careful. You have to be very, not at some point, you have to be very careful with that. And ultimately is that we have to do everything that we can to help our children thrive. And if they're struggling and going through difficult times, it doesn't matter what Fulan and Fultan, other people say about that. That's between them and their Lord, and we have to support them, and we have to help them, and help them get through that particular stage. And sometimes is that children of even very pious people go through very difficult times. And it's the nature of the world in which we live. We've been in a very, very difficult time, as we've been saying. And so this first stage is the stage where someone avoids doing anything that would compromise their uprightness and that put them in a situation where their testimony would not be accepted. And what that means simply is that for them to avoid anything that would be haram, that we know that the scholars of Islam have said, this is haram, this is forbidden. And again, you could go a little bit deeper and say, okay, what about if there was a difference of opinion? If there's a difference of opinion there, then that there's room for them as long as there's difference of opinion. But the things that are clearly known, that this is not something that you should do. If someone would do those things, they wouldn't have this degree of scrupulousness. So essentially, it's that basic degree of avoiding what is forbidden. And this is the first stage. And this is important. This is where we begin. But then there's 3 stages after that. So then we have what is called the wara' as-salihin. And this is the scrupulousness of the righteous. And essentially, this degree is where even though the fatwa of the scholar has said that this thing is permissible, but it still is possible that the thing is haram. Okay, the fatwa is that it's permissible, but it's one of these doubtful matters. And this is a classic example of something that's good for someone to leave. So this is the second degree. Then we have the third degree, which is the wara', the scrupulousness of the muttaqeen, the God conscious. And this relates to that which is not haram, and there's no doubt about its lawfulness, but it is feared that it could lead to something haram. We'll come back to these. I'm just mentioning them. We'll come back to examples of them. And then we have the fourth and highest degree. There's no harm in it, nor is it feared that it will lead to harm, but it does not help someone draw near to Allah. So for this group, it's just simply, is this going to help me get closer to Allah or not? If it is, marhaban. If not, I'm not going to do it. And that's a very easy criterion. That really helps. And to some degree, you and I can use that, even without claiming that degree. But to some degree, can we use it? Just really think about it. And I learned this from my teachers. It's a beautiful way. There's 3 steps that they would mention. And the first is to weigh anything that someone wants to do in the scales of the sacred law. That's number 1. Figure out what the hukm is. Ask, consult, figure out what the ruling is. And it's okay on certain matters that you've already fallen into. Oh, actually, this is also a very good principle. So remind me to come back to that so I don't forget. So in general, if we've yet to do something, we should try to be as scrupulous as possible. But if something has already happened, to the degree that there's a need, we can take a dispensation. Does that make sense? So someone comes to you and says that I want to get married and I'm going to follow the Hanafi school. I want to just marry her on the side. I don't want to tell her parents or her guardians, right? And then I want to join to that thematic opinion where you don't need shahood. So I just want to get married and over the phone on top of all of that, right? You advise them that's probably not the best idea. That why don't we talk to their family, convince them. It's a good thing to have witnesses, have it be in person, make it known, right? So you encourage people to be more scrupulous, okay? But let's just say that someone just ran off and got married, and in a way that was invalid according to some schools, but valid according to others. And let's just say that they've already had relations or something like that. This is where it's a good thing to find opinions that can carry what it is that they've carried them for what it is that they've done. And then you might say to them, okay, well, let's also renew the contract as well moving forward. So there's other ways of also dealing with things of this nature. And that, again, that anyone who's dealt with complicated questions like this, you'd be surprised the type of questions that people have. If someone's looking for ways of investing, that's very different than if someone's already been investing for 10 years. And if someone's already has an established career as opposed to someone who's looking into a career, these are 2 very different things. But this is, we need to be there for our people in a ways and make things clear for them so they make good decisions from the beginning. And it's twofold. 1, inspiring people to seek knowledge. But 2, is it really having high degrees of quality scholarship where we really understand what people are going through and we can help give them religious guidance and tailor it to them and where they are at in the stations of religion. And that's not easy. That doesn't come in a 5-year bachelor-like program. That takes time to train people in this. It takes time. But these are the type of people that we need, that know how to put everything in its proper place. And that we need the type of people as well. And this is the way of our teachers when we speak about the door of da'wah, and I'm jumping to something else entirely, is that when it comes to da'wah, i.e. calling people to this religion, or helping people, let's just say that are in level 1, that are doing all the haram that's out there, is that we should be willing with the condition that we are safe in and of ourselves to take that if something is permissible in terms of a wasila of da'wah, that a means of giving da'wah to someone, that according to any of the opinion of the scholars, to take that to help anyone. With their certain conditions, one of them being that we're protected in and of ourselves. That's a da'wah methodology. And that you would be surprised, the people that might be affected, people that you would least think would ever be affected. And some of the most uncommon places that you could possibly imagine. But that's a different topic. So, if we've yet to do something, we want to be as scrupulous as possible. If we have already done something, this is where the one helping you, the person of knowledge, should find opinions to carry your action for what you've already done. Tamam? Now, I've already forgotten what was I saying. The 3 degrees. So what we said, the first thing was, when you think about doing something that you want to do, is what? Rulings of the sacred law. Where does it fit in the scale? Okay. Number 2 is that you can bring to mind the righteous people you know. Would they do it? Okay, so what's an example? Going to some beach in Hawaii, into some hotel resort in Hawaii, and the time of year where you know there's a lot of people that go, and you're like right on the beach. And you know for sure what you're going to get when you go there. People are going to be partying. People are going to be dressed a certain way. And is it haram for you to do that? Said Yusuf, what would you tell someone? Huh? Definitely. Right? So maybe that's not the best of examples then. Right? Let me think of another example. What's that? So going to a certain type of restaurant, right? Okay, going to, I was going to say, okay, that did cross my mind, like Dorney Park or Six Flags or something like that. Okay. Is it permissible to, that in and of itself, to go to a theme park? So Yusuf, what would you tell them? Jais, right? But we did that one time for Eid. It was after a beautiful month of Ramadan, and we were thinking this would be so fun to take everybody there, and then we got there, like, this is the worst decision ever. Like, we just spent this blessed time, and then all of a sudden you're just ruining your heart by all of these images you're seeing. Right now, if the whole Muslim community could rent it out and no one else was there, that would be different. Going to a water, so my point is that thinking very carefully about what it is that we do, and that finding that other ways of that doing things where, what's the point of that? Okay, the point is that we have some type of community celebration after Ramadan, which is a beautiful thing, but it doesn't have to be at Dorney Park, right? It could be somewhere else. It could be, so you can achieve the same thing that you're really seeking, but in a very lawful, halal way. And so, so could you imagine your teachers, right, at Dorney Park, right? I could imagine my teachers swimming. I've been swimming with my teachers. I could imagine them relaxing. I could imagine them walking. I could imagine them going to a park. I could imagine them even eating ice cream and relaxing and things of this nature. There's a lot of very good permissible things that I could imagine our teachers doing. But then I don't really see our teachers riding these crazy roller coasters and putting their hands in the air and saying, ha, right? And all this kind of, that's not really their way of doing things. But are we saying that it's haram? No. But that's a second criterion, right? And again, when we talk about the stations of religion, I'm not saying that don't ever go to Dorney Park or any of these places. That's not what I'm saying at all. But what I am saying is that we should think things through. We should think things through. And sometimes with kids, especially, less so with adults, is that you have to expose them to a little bit of that so they didn't feel like they missed out on anything. But again, it's to the right degree. And I'm not saying it's wajib and you have to do that. Every family is different. Some families never do that. But other families, and everyone's family dynamic is different, right? Converts where you have kids that are exposed to a lot more because of their relatives are very different than two people that have the same ethnicity or from the same background. That's very different. So every situation is different. That when I go on family trips, that with most of my family who's not Muslim, Right? I can't tell them to always go to a halal restaurant or go here or there. You end up in places where la hawla wa la quwwata illa billah, you don't want to be. And so in those instances, you have to make sure your intentions are right and mitigate as much as you can some of the potential harms. So these things are very delicate. They really depend on different types of people and different things. People in the work world will all have their situations that they're exposed to, and that work meetings and work parties and these types of things, and even lunches and this type of thing. And all of these things are important, that we be as balanced as possible based upon our own specific circumstances. But then the third criterion is what you incline towards. And so as you get closer and closer to Allah, is that obviously you want to make sure that it's legitimate according to the sacred law. You think about whether your teachers would do it or not. And then the last check, but this requires a little bit of skill, is that you check your nafs. Does your nafs want to do it or not? And usually when your nafs wants to do something, you have to be a little bit suspect. And it doesn't mean that you don't do it, but you have to just think about it. Is it, why does, sometimes something happens and you want to send a text right then and there. And sometimes it's better to stop, let your emotions settle, and then see if you should send the text or not. You would have regretted if you sent it then. But if you waited, your nafs wants to do it, or just wants to do something at a specific time, and you don't realize, like, oh wait, I'm going to pray Maghrib 45 minutes late if I go shopping right now. Think about it. No, I'd rather not go right now. Oh, I have to wait till tomorrow. It's going to be a little bit more difficult, but that's better, because now I can pray my Maghrib prayer on time and just postpone that till tomorrow. So that's like the last criterion, though. So that's very helpful. It's a very helpful way of thinking about these things. So where were we? We were talking about the scrupulousness of the upright. That's very clear, right? That's essentially avoiding the forbidden. Then the scrupulousness of the righteous. And that what this really is about is avoiding the things that might be permissible by fatwa, but there's still some type of there's still some possibility that it might be haram. And this is what Ustad Yusuf is going to speak about tomorrow. But amongst the shubahat, the doubtful matters, there are those that are an obligation upon us to avoid. Then there are those that are recommended for us to avoid. And then there are those that it's actually makruh for us to avoid. And this is where we get into understanding wara, is that it has a limit. There's a limit to our scrupulousness. And then beyond that is that it's waswasa and misgivings from the shaitan. You don't go there. And this is where our Prophet said, halakan mutanatti'un, halakan mutanatti'un. People become so extreme in their practice that they destroy themselves. And then they destroy other people. And this is the nature of being extreme, and it has a shelf life. Someone can't live like that. And this is the nature of the people of bid'ah too, the people of innovation, is that they get more and more extreme and more extreme. And one group is excommunicating a whole bunch of other people, and then that one group all of a sudden starts excommunicating people from that own group, and then they get even more strict, and then a new mosque opens up, and then they're speaking about no one's on the minhaj, not even those people, and then another mosque opens up until there's very few people left in the ummah. And you have to be very, very, very careful with that mentality. Very careful. And ultimately, there is an acceptable, to use the word continuum again, of valid approaches to the religion. Some of them are more lenient, and some of them are more strict. And all differences in the sacred law are ultimately that two sides of the scale. One side is leniency, and the other side is strictness. Imam Sha'rani has an incredibly beautiful book. He has actually several books on the topic. One of them is titled Mizan al-Kubra, the Great Scale, where he goes through and shows, based upon some of the main differences of opinion amongst the different schools and the great mujtahid imams, how the best way you can understand their differences is that it creates a scale, or if you will, a continuum between leniency and strictness. And what a blessing that we have a deen like that. And this is why, even though we're required to follow one particular school, the schools are not the Sharia. The schools are not the Sharia. The sacred law of the Prophet ﷺ that is broader than the four schools. The four schools, the ones that have been preserved, even though there could have been 20, but Allah willed for there to be 4, that they preserve that the Sharia of our Prophet ﷺ, that as it manifested over time. But there still is opinions, in almost all of the opinions, most of the opinions, almost all of the companions and of the early mujtahid imams are found in the various schools. But there's some opinions that are even outside the 4 schools. And then the dominant opinion there is it's not permissible to give fatwa with an opinion like that unless it be an absolute necessity. An absolute necessity. Right? So there, an example of that were someone that do a 3-fold divorce. There is an opinion outside that the 4 schools is that it doesn't, but that can only be used that if it has to be that someone is in a situation so severe that their life's at risk or something that in normal situations, you can't take that opinion, khalas. Anyhow, that's a whole other topic in of itself. But the point here is that there's different degrees of shubuhat. This is what we have to know to then ask the right questions for anything that is that we do. So when we get into these issues of, am I going to eat machine slaughtered chicken or not? Am I going to eat at a restaurant that serves alcohol? Am I going to invest in this certain type of sock? Am I going to buy that a house with that a loan from that a company that sells quote unquote Islamic loans, and so forth and so on? What are we going to do? We should ask people that know these topics and that give us that an informed opinion and let us know is that where scrupulousness lies without making things difficult upon ourselves. So this is what we want to ask. And then there's certain things where no, you just simply have to leave. Then there's things where it's better for you to leave, and if you do it, you'll move up to this degree of the scrupulousness of the righteous. And then the third degree is the scrupulousness of the God conscious. And Imam Al-Ghazali says this is rooted in a hadith of our Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. لا يبلغ العبد درجة المتقين حتى. A servant will not reach the degree of the muttaqin, the God conscious, until حتى يضع ما لا بأس به مخافة ما به بأس. Until he leaves those things that are not harmful out of fear of them leading to something that was harmful. And Sayyidina Umar ibn Khattab said, كنا نضع 9 أعشار الحلال مخافة أن نقع في الحرام. Is that we used to leave 90% of the halal out of fear of falling into the haram. And some say that Ibn Abbas said this. And Imam Al-Ghazali mentions an example of this. مثل التورع عن التحدث بأحوال الناس. So just about speaking very openly about the states of people. خيفة من الانجرار إلى الغيبة. Out of fear of falling into ghiba. So if we're not careful in our conversations about people, very easily, with our friends, with our spouses, even with our children, with family, with other people, very easily, if we're not careful, that it can go from a permissible conversation to haram. And the longer time that we spend talking to someone, and especially if it's a group, is that the more susceptible we come to falling into this. So what speaking to your friends is permissible, speaking to family members is permissible. But they used to be very careful about what they spoke about because of the fear of it leading to something like riba, something like backbiting. This is just one example. And another example is that the fear that they had for overeating. And this is also, we know that when we overeat, is that it riles up the desires within ourselves. And if you eat till you're so full, do you have energy to wake up? Do you have energy to then study or to worship? Is that it creates a state where you don't have much energy to do anything that religious. وهكذا. And so there's other examples that they mention here of this type of group. But in general, is that it's at this level where someone becomes very careful about even doing what is permissible and making sure that they don't go into excess, and of course making sure that they have a good intention behind it. And then the last degree, which is the highest of all, which we'll just cover because we have to know that people like this exist, is the wara of the Siddiqeen, is the scrupulousness of the highest saints. And this is the highest degree of all. And these are people essentially who don't do anything that they feel will help them draw nearer to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And they know even by doing this thing, there's no harm in it, nor is it feared that it will lead to harm. That's the previous degree. Leaving things, in and of itself, those things are not harmful, they're permissible, but they fear that if you go into excess in these matters, that it will lead to something harmful. Whereas this state is even higher, where it's like, is this going to help me draw near to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala or not? And so those are the four states and the four ascending degrees of scrupulousness. And what we want is to take a path and to do the best that we can to move up in these degrees. And this is why when we talk about bringing wara into our lives, what's important is, and Imam Ghazali has this beautiful statement where he says, لا ينبغي أن يشتغل إنسان بدقائق الورع إلا بحضرة عالم متقن. Is that we shouldn't get into that detailed degrees of scrupulousness and try to implement them without learning from a skilled scholar, because we might get ourselves in trouble. You want to start with what's clear, and then you want to slowly take the path of wara. And this is why, again, coming back to this same point, attached to a scholarly methodology. Attached to a scholarly methodology. Learn from living scholars whom you trust, who you know are licensed to teach. Read what Imam Ghazali says in Book 1 about the signs of the scholars of this hereafter, and make sure you see the majority of those signs in your teachers. And have religious maturity. Know what you should learn from whom. Know what you should learn from whom. We have to have realistic expectations, especially in a place like the United States of America. There's many people now teaching, but people have different degrees of ability that impart religious guidance. And that ultimately, that there are always going to be people that we need in our lives that can teach us what other people can't. So benefit from everybody, but know what to benefit from who. Know what questions to ask whom. And if we have this connection, then this will open up the door for us to that increase in this. What's most important is that we have this clarity and that set out on a path to draw near to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So we actually finished with a little bit of extra time. So because we didn't have questions and Q&A in the first sessions, we can take a few questions now, inshallah ta'ala, we can take a few questions.
Assalamu alaikum. Do you in order to give da'wah, do you have to be like approved by a certain teacher?
So what I would say to that is that when we give da'wah, there's many different forms of giving da'wah, right? And the many different manifestations, if you will, of giving da'wah. And the most important type of da'wah that we can give is da'wah with our state, right? Where people just see who you are and are impacted by it. So we have a friend who's here from Toronto, our dear brother, Sidi Yasser. He was just explaining to me how 2 years in a row that Sheikh Abdullah Mbeya, when he came to the RIS conference, is that one of the police officers who was there that tending to his needs and that saw him and spent a few days with him and said, I want to be on the religion of this man, and became Muslim. Same thing happened the year after that or sometime after that, that also a police officer spent time with him and he's there tending to his needs and then he became Muslim. This is the very best form of da'wah of all, is that people get impacted by our state before we say anything, and they just see the reality of our faith being put into practice. And then there's a level of da'wah where you just smile at people. And then there's a level of da'wah where you just say something that you know that they need in the moment. Then there's a level of the da'wah where you clarify to them some reality of the religion that they need to know. All of those types of things, you don't necessarily need to have permission from a particular teacher, right? You just want to make sure that what you're doing and what you're saying is the right thing. And if that's the case, then, but having said all of that, it's still a good thing to have a connection to teachers, right? That you can regularly learn from. The type of da'wah that would need permission from teachers is where you start to teach any of the sciences of the religion, right? That you want to make sure that you've studied them with the teacher who then says that you're ready now to teach those sciences. But there's many forms of da'wah, and there's a whole other type of da'wah where someone should just proactively think about their God-given abilities and how it is that they can contribute. There's 1,001 different ways that we can give da'wah. We don't want to narrow da'wah down to speaking publicly or delivering a sermon or teaching a class. Those are some of the greatest forms of da'wah, but there's 1,001 other things that people can do that are also considered to be da'wah. And many of those things, as long as they're grounded in knowledge that we've taken from qualified scholarship, then you don't necessarily need permission to do them, if that makes sense. So I'm kind of expanding our understanding of da'wah, but there are instances, yes, where you do need that permission, especially it relates to teaching sciences. Yeah. Let's take a sister and then we'll come back to you. Anyone on the sister side? If there is one, otherwise we'll come back to the brothers. Fadl. Come sit up to me. Okay.
My question was in relation to some of the states you mentioned in the previous session. We're talking about the highest ranks of people, whether it be in terms of taqwa or ubudiyya, more generally when you were speaking about the 9 or the 5 ranks. Thinking about reaching the highest ranks, is that something that is locked? Is that state locked behind becoming a scholar? Or is that something with that, people that in wherever Allah has placed them or whatever profession?
No, I understand, yeah.
So I was kind of wanting to understand that level of that.
You could reach the highest degrees, the 9th degree, or you could reach the 5th degree of taqwa and not be a scholar. What you would be required to know is what you need to know for your religious practice. Right? So if someone says, okay, that's what a scholar is, but it happens regularly where there's people who reach the highest degree of wilayah, of sainthood, but they're not a scholar in the sense where they could teach the advanced books of fiqh or the advanced books of hadith or the Islamic legal theory or something like that. Right? So yes, it's very possible, but what I would say is that's not to downplay knowledge, is that if someone's going to reach that degree, is that they need to know what they need to know. So the most important knowledge that we need to know is what pertains to functioning that within the bounds of the sacred law, and then opening up the door for the subtleties of scrupulousness in relation to our own selves. So like if I'm not investing in the stock market, I don't have to know personally whether that's permissible or not. If my investments are just here, I only need to, and maybe I don't even have investments, right? Then I don't need to know anything about investments. So we have to know what pertains to us. So that knowledge is important for us to get. And this is what I'm hoping that our educational institutions do, is that they really serve the community in a very practical sense and give them the knowledge that they need that pertains to what they need to know for them to remain within the boundaries of the halal. But to answer your correct question directly, is that no, someone does not have to be a scholar to reach these highest degrees, right? And having said that, it's still one of the greatest forms of service to attain that level of knowledge that can then help other people. Yeah. And the proof of that is that how many of the Sahaba were scholars? Many of them reached the highest degree of closeness to Allah Ta'ala. And only a small number, a tiny percentage, gave fatwa. Only a very small number of the overall number that memorized the Quran, and so forth.
Yeah. I just want to clarify the 9 stations for the lowest rank that was mentioned before. I just want to clarify whether it is only La ilaha illallah or La ilaha illallah Muhammadur Rasulullah, because where I come from, there is a group that only believe La ilaha illallah, but not Rasulullah.
Yeah, no, that's a whole separate thing. When Imam Al-Maqasid says that bi kalimat at-tawheed, what he's essentially saying is that the hadith of Shafa'ah mentions taking someone out of the fire, anyone who says La ilaha illallah once. And what's understood from that, like if someone's taking the shahada, of course, is that one's obliged to say La ilaha illallah Muhammadur Rasulullah. If someone affirms La ilaha illallah, but they don't affirm Muhammadur Rasulullah, they're not Muslim. You can't be Muslim without affirming the second part of the kalimat at-tawheed, which is that Muhammad is the messenger of Allah, and to testify to that. So yeah, he's referring to, just in a very general way, as someone who just has only basically said the shahada, and after that is that they don't do anything else. But the specific answer is yes. What's understood from that is that they've affirmed that the oneness of Allah and that the Prophet ﷺ is a prophet. So maybe just take 1 or 2 more quick questions. Let's let someone, and then we'll come here. Good question. That's a good interactive session question. What are some of the signs that Allah is pleased with our actions? And what are some of the signs that He is not pleased with our actions? And I think that we can look where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has placed us. And that one of the great signs is that if you look at yourself and you find yourself that doing acts of obedience, and that wanting to be in a state of obedience, this is one of the great signs that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has blessed you with. And then that as those acts of obedience move from being a burden to being something that we enjoy and find pleasure in, that's an even greater sign that we're closer to His rida subhanahu wa ta'ala. And then the opposite is true. And when you look at your heart, and then I'd say that the only other thing I'd say after that is to what degree are we attached to the remembrance of Allah? Is it one of the great signs that we've received the contentment of Allah? Is that you find great comfort and desire in remembering Allah, right? And that's a very good sign. So those are just a few, and I'm sure there's others that we can mention. Whereas a hard heart would be one of the great examples of a sign that we need working on. Your heart's just hard. And that weeping for the sake of Allah is also a very good sign of the softness of the heart. MashaAllah, we'll take maybe one more question here. Dr. Yasser. Okay.
there's not another question on the sister's side, we have one question here, and that may be the final one,
Okay.
if in order of sequence.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa
Salam
barakatuh.
tabarakatuh.
I guess I wanted to ask what the journey of wara, like, increasing your wara throughout your life looks like, and how to kind of, like, as one gains knowledge and realizes, like, maybe some of the things that they do in their everyday life are not really so permissible and whatnot, and you try to increase your scrupulousness, I feel like it can be easy to kind of despair in a sense. Like, you think of, some idyllic life. Maybe you live on the outskirts of Hadramaut, growing your own vegetables or something. Yeah, and maybe then you can be, avoiding.
Let's all just move. Khalas.
Yeah.
We'll just move Maqasid to.
Perfect. Yeah. I feel like, we have that. You might despair, with our, the difficulties we face living here and whatnot.
Sure.
And
Sure.
how do you kind of reconcile these?
I'm really glad you brought that up. Thank you so much, because I think you're speaking on behalf of many of us when you say that, because it is very easy to despair. So thank you very much for bringing that up. And we've tried our best to cover this topic and not have that happen, right? That's why we've tried to add in some of these other things that are not even in the ihya, out of fear of it being misunderstood and creating that feeling in the hearts of people. That's what we've been trying to avoid. But what does it look like? It's actually not that hard. What it looks like is that you have a few things that you do on a daily and weekly basis consistently and over an extended period of time. That's what it looks like. So this is not some major shifts overnight, everything changes right off the bat. No, this is over an extended period of time. Then the question is, what are those things? Being around good people, the best people we have access to. That learning regularly, at least one class a week. Reading a book on the heart, starting with a book like Bidayat al-Hidayah, and I can give you a whole list of other books. Every night read 5 pages for 10 minutes before you go to bed. Attend one gathering of remembrance a week. And then have some basic things that you do on a daily basis. The prophetic invocations in the morning and the evening, making sure you're praying your 5 daily prayers, and a few other things that I could mention. So it's not that much. But doing that consistently for years, then it will naturally happen in an organic way, without despair, and without too much hardship, without taking steps that are too little, nor taking steps that are too far apart, such that you trip up. And to me, that's what it looks like. And this is why we have in our vision and mission statement this idea of creating environments. What people need is environments. What we're lacking in a place like the United States of America is that we lack nurturing environments where people can come into a space and they can be nurtured. And they can pray their 5 daily prayers. And they can have dhikr around the 5 daily prayers. And there's a weekly gathering of remembrance. And there's other classes during the week that talk about the spiritual path. And then there's seminars that are put on from time to time and retreats. And then you have the full-time students. It has various offerings. Ultimately, we need multiple places like this in every major and small city in the United States of America. That's the goal. Where 50 years down the line, we have 10,000 plus people trained to go that do the same work that is being done from the place they studied all throughout the United States of America. All throughout Latin America, because they're our closest neighbor, other than Canada. And then maybe some Canadians as well. But we can't get visas for them yet. So we've had some people who wanted to come study with us from Canada, but we got to work on the whole visa thing. So that's what it looks like. And then inshallah, that's what we hope, is that it actually doesn't take that much. And then once that door opens up, is that once someone tastes the sweetness of that, then they're naturally going to want more. And then you got to be careful. Don't try to do too much. Just little by little, add a little bit, so you don't get overwhelmed. But it certainly is overwhelming. But that's why, and the last thing I'll say is you can remember the hadith of our Prophet. It's a beautiful hadith. He said that لن يدخل أحدكم عمله الجنة. none of your acts of any one of you will enter you into paradise. وَلَا أَنْتَ يَا رَسُولَ اللَّهِ. Not even you, O Messenger of Allah. وَلَا أَنَا, not even me, إِلَّا أَنْ يَتَغَمَّدِنِي اللَّهُ بِرَحْمَتِهِ. Unless Allah envelops me with His mercy. Meaning is that we will only enter into paradise by the mercy of Allah, not by our actions. And that's comforting. And the other hadith is that Allah subhanahu, whoever man salaka tariqan yaltamisu fi ilmin, whoever sets out on a path to seek sacred knowledge, sahhalallahu lahu bihi tariqan ila jannah. We all heard the hadith, but look at what our Prophet is saying. Whoever sets out on a path to learn sacred knowledge, Allah will facilitate for him through it, i.e. that path, a way to paradise. So in other words, Allah will give you what you need. So if we look at what we need, what we think we need, and what we need, it will despair. But this is where we place our trust in Allah. Do what you can, place your trust in Allah, and that know that your actions aren't going to get you into paradise anyway. And place your trust in Allah while doing everything you can. Iyaka na'budu wa iyaka nasta'in. It's all right there in the Fatiha. And if we live like that, then inshallah, the doors will open up. So the two brothers had your hands up. Inshallah, we'll start with you all in the interactive session, inshallah ta'ala.
Could I see those two brothers? I see one here, and who is the other one? Just so I...
Sayyidina Mujahid and then brother next. Yeah.
MashaAllah, tamam. So, Jazakumullah khair afwan for making this announcement from the side. This concludes, alhamdulillah, session 5 on wara'. At this time, we'll take a break from